Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
And this is the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast. This week, our guest is Niro Feliciano, who is a psychotherapist, an author, a speaker, and she's just very connected and a specialist on anxiety, which I know a lot of us are feeling this at this point in life. And we wanted to start with a little bit of a conversation on something that's meaningful for her too, is spirituality, because we've never really done anything with that on our podcast, and how sometimes we back burner our values and our spirituality and get a little lost in all the noise in the rest of the world. So, Niro, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for coming here. And her book is called This Book Won't Make You Happy.
Let's check it out.
But I'm guessing it might help. So thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How'd you wind up on this path?
On the path, are you talking about a spiritual path or to becoming a therapist?
Well,
and they actually were intertwined.
Yeah, a little about your backstory.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a very spiritual home. And I will say my mother was the spiritual leader in our family, came from generations of very faithful, faith-filled people. And I'm Sri Lankan, South Asian. So in Sri Lanka, even though I was born in Brooklyn, where my family comes from is a mixture of many different religions. We have Christians and Buddhists and Hindus, and a small population of Muslims too. So we were very much exposed to a lot of different religious traditions, but I was raised Christian. Half my family's Hindu. My dad was Hindu when they got married. He later on became a Christian in the marriage. So my household was Christian, but it was very much not, although we did go to church, faith was very real to us. We saw the way that God had intervened in our lives. There was a civil war in Sri Lanka, so our ethnic group was the one targeted in terms of ethnic cleansing, the Tamils. So my parents were already here, but in many miraculous situations, they were able to get their whole family out of Sri Lanka. So we had a lot of faith during that time, and we saw how spirituality really became connected to how we lived our lives and how we navigated our lives, and trusting in something bigger, knowing that you're being led on a path. So I grew up in that mindset. But I left home at 14. I went to boarding school in Connecticut, which is where I'm from. And when you're that young and you grow up pretty much, even though I saw my parents every week, they'd come to visit, we're a close family, your day-to-day is kind of on your own. And I would say that was the point where my faith became more personal. I began to connect to God for direction, for comfort, for reassurance, even as a 14 and 15-year-old, and began to see how my life was guided in that way. So that's pretty young to come into your faith beliefs, but you, like any relationship, right? You develop more trust in it the longer that you're committed to it. Like when you start a dating relationship, you can't trust that person until you really get to know them and see that they're credible and that they've been consistent in your life. And I think faith is very similar in that way. I have a lot of faith stories because I've been walking this path for a long time. And even my journey into becoming a therapist, I think there was a calling on my life a long time ago. If you talk to most therapists, they've been doing this work long before they actually got clinically trained in it. And I was the person even in grade school that people came to talk about their problems. My whole name is actually Niroshini. It means peacemaker. But I did not go into the field right away. I actually went to medical school first. And I didn't plan to marry a surgeon right before I started medical school, but that's what I did. And our paths were very different in terms of timeline. So I ended up, after my first year, taking the year off. And that was very spiritually directed too. A lot of prayer went into that decision because I really wanted to become a doctor. I wanted to become a surgeon as well. I wanted to go into OBGYN. But there was something in me, like a spiritual sense, that felt like that may not be the right path for me. So I took a year off and then started actually getting formal training for what I'd been doing for a long time, which is in counseling and psychotherapy, and then ended up pursuing that as a career instead.
That's an interesting story. So what made you at 14 head out on your own?
Well, I was always pretty academically gifted. And I had some cousins who went away to these schools, and I was told this is where smart people go. And I was like, well, I'm smart. I want to go too. And then the funny thing is, when I got there, I was so homesick, and my parents did not want me to go away. We are a tight family. I'm actually not sending my kids to boarding school, even though I think they're great opportunities. I'm going to keep my kids with me as long as I can. And when I got there, I was so homesick, and my parents said, you said that you wanted to go here. And my response to them was like, why are you listening to a 14-year-old? Why would you even listen to a 14-year-old? But there were some really great opportunities there. And it's tough to be away that young, and what boarding schools are like. There's a lot of pressure. But I think having been in that situation was really what made my faith more real to me. I felt like I wasn't alone. I felt like I had this guidance, even that young, even at that time.
And I have to have this caveat for the listeners, because Michelle and I are never going to tell people you need to believe this or that. We're never going to say you got to believe in God. But we both do. And when you say you don't feel alone, that's always been my definition of what God, which is what I refer to my universe or spirituality, right? It has given me. I've never felt alone. There's always a place to go. And it's been really, I didn't have the same path you had. I was spiritual, then not at all, just not an atheist, but definite strong agnostic. And then it took a lot of work to get me back to where I am. And it's, I've said for a long time, it's my primary relationship. And I feel lucky for that. How about you, Michelle?
Well, same thing. I mean, grew up very, very strong in a Christian home. Faith was very important, but it was my dad's relationship with God was out in nature. My mom was more formal, following, traditional religion and going to church. And I was very active in my church. Now, when I went off to college, I distanced myself and started, I think like most people do that age, where you start questioning your relationship. But I find that it was more around the structure of religion. And then, what better time to really deepen your roots is whenever you have struggle. And I was also dealing with a lot of struggle at that time, and which brought me closer to God and my relationship there. And then as I've gotten older, it has, I've been more open and tolerant of various other religions, and I'll say maybe the better word is curious, much more curious and open and understanding. But at the end of the day, I follow the path that is right for me, but I also respect what someone else believes is the right rituals or whatever we want to call it that they follow that's right for them. It's just about having that relationship with God, I think, because I realize that I really don't have a place to judge someone else. And I also know, to your point, Fawn, if I'm trying to dictate to someone why they're wrong, that doesn't solve anything. And it doesn't, in fact, I'm probably pushing them away from exploring their faith.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Michelle. And I've learned so much from people of other faiths as well. I mean, I am a Christian, and not even in an organized sense so much anymore, but I follow the teachings of Jesus. I believe I have a connection with God that's very personal. But there's so much that I've learned from other religions, especially having other religions in my family. It was funny because I remember asking my mom because my mom has such a strong faith. And I said, how did you marry a Hindu? How did that work for you? You were the last person that I would think would do that, just knowing how important your faith is to you. And she said, your father acted more like a Christian than most of the Christian boys that I met, and he, I mean, even when he wasn't a Christian, that's how he lived his life. And it's obviously more than just living your life, but I could understand that. I could wrap my mind around that. That's what she was attracted to, was
The
heart of
values.
people. Yeah.
The values.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here, and this is the first time I've noticed that I did this. I didn't just come right out and say I'm Jewish.
I noticed.
And which is very important to me, which I've always been. I mean, it's very important, but I do feel like right now it's very vulnerable time for us. And, I don't go to the synagogue. I say I go to the big synagogue. So I go to the beach and I do my work out there, and it seems to be working. But that's an interesting thing. Off topic. I just felt like I needed to say that, because why wouldn't I say that? And that's a comment on what's going on in the world right now.
I think that's so relevant, Fawn. It's so relevant. And I've been very blessed to have many very close friends who are Jewish, who are feeling that too. And I think what you said, Michelle, about it's these times when we're in struggle where our faith grows the most. And I believe that. I really believe that. I wish it'd grow when things were good. But oftentimes, we have this false sense of control, like everything's up to us. And it's not till we come to the end of ourselves, which are in those moments of uncertainty and struggle, that I think we begin to lean into faith and realize we're not alone at that time. And I think that's really important for Jewish people now, to lean into their faith right now in this time of uncertainty.
I have friends who are just, unabashedly atheists. I have friends in two different categories. Some of the atheist ones actually ridicule people who do believe in God, which I find very offensive, because I would not ridicule them for not believing. But they're just like, if you can't prove it, this story is ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And I just feel like, boy, what an empty life that would have to be, because I can't prove it. But there's that other group of friends that wishes they could, and they don't seem to know how to access it, and they don't know where to find it, but wish they had it. And so what do you tell people like that?
Yeah. I recognize, for me, faith is a gift. I didn't choose to be born into a home with faithful people, but I was, and I feel very gifted that I had that experience. And I can understand people who don't, and especially looking at the world and looking at the suffering, asking that question, how does God exist? When you say it can feel more or less hopeless when you don't have that connection, that's my feeling. Because what you're saying, I guess, if you don't believe in God, is like, this is it. This is all we have, this life. And to me, that's not justice. The idea of, no, there will be justice and restoration and something bigger and better than this is what gives me hope to be able to work through the suffering now. But if I thought that it ended here, that to me would feel very hopeless and dark, and also just sad that I'm not going to be connected with the people that I love after this life. I never fault people for feeling that way. I think everyone has a good reason and a good story why they've come into their beliefs. And it's interesting, when I wrote my book, one of the 8 keys of contentment I wrote about was faith, because there's so much research on not only people who have faith are more resilient and essentially are happier and more content, but there's so much research now into the science of neurotheology, how our brains were wired for faith, for existential experiences, for spiritual experiences, how parts of our brain shut off when we're in prayer, just so we can connect to something bigger than us. So what I would say to those people is, stay curious, be open to other people's experiences, ask questions to learn more, and also think about what is it that's preventing you from being open to something that's bigger than yourself? What do you have to lose by being open to that? And what do you have to gain? For me, there's so much evidence out there, depending on how you want to look at it. I have a friend who actually had a near-death experience at 9 years old. She died and came back and has memories of what was on the other side. And, if you watch those things on TV, you might think, I'm a little skeptical. This is a friend who I know very personally, who's a good friend of mine, and I've seen how it's transformed her whole life. And not only that, her spiritual gifting. There are people who have spiritual giftings who know things. In my own life, I've experienced miracles that I can't really explain. So it's out there. There's scientists and doctors who've talked about faith from a different lens. But I think that the key is to be curious about it and open, because at the end of it, what do you have to lose? Really, what do you have to lose to hear the story?
You hit on a interesting point, because you were talking about what did you call it? You said spiritual gifts, but you were dancing around a little bit of maybe a medium or maybe channeling or
like a prophetic. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I find interesting with particularly women colleagues, women my age, professional women, I was pulling in a small group. I was doing some small group coaching with executive women, and we would get together for dinner and we would invite people. And as women would get there, the topic of faith would start. But what I found was a lot of these women had distanced themselves from church, yet they were seekers with spirituality, and they were very spiritual. But it was like, and then I believe in, like it was this quiet, I don't really want to admit it. Are you going to judge me? But I'm finding that so many women, or that are really opening up to more spirituality, and they're feeling a bit guilty, like they're not, like it's not okay to believe in that. And it is a huge inner conflict happening. What have you found around that, and how to sort of reconcile that you can be open to these different ideas, these spiritual ideas, and the formal religion?
I think for many people, their boxes for spirituality and for God are too small. And there was someone who once said, if God was small enough to be understood, he wouldn't be big enough to be worshiped. And I loved that. I loved that. And I think that we have to be open to connecting and communicating with God in so many different ways. And I think just like your partner knows your love language, they know how to talk to you. I think God speaks to different people in different ways. For me, it's always come through a lot of written word, but it's also come through other people. And when you were talking about kind of, what people call mediums or prophetics, my friend who had that near-death experience has these spiritual giftings where she knows things before they happen. Now, she didn't call herself a medium. And she's also taught me there are dark spirits as well as light. And you have to learn to stay in the light. That's how she describes it. And there are many people who are into darkness, and it doesn't bring good things from it, fear, those types of things. And she told me probably years before it happened, she said, Niro, I know one day you're going to be on the Today Show. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't know anybody there. I'm not going to be there. So fast forward a couple of years later, I get a call. I had pitched for a few years to say, okay, hey, we're ready for you. Let's talk about your book. And I said, okay. So the day before I went on the Today Show, my children are amazing in terms of their spirituality because they're so unhindered. They're so unabashedly open to experience. And I have one of my children, Sophia, who's now 12, but she's had spiritual giftings, these knowings since she was little. And the day before I went on the Today Show, she said to me, Mama, you know how you've done other news and at first it was a big deal and then it wasn't a big deal. You just kept going. And I said, yeah. And she said, that's what's going to happen on the Today Show. And I always ask her the same question. I'm like, Sophia, how do you know? And she'll say, I just know. When she was little, she'd say, I just knowed. But as she got older, I just know. And I was like, baby, you don't understand. The Today Show, they don't do that. I'm going on for my book. I just did my 10th segment last week on the Today Show. They just kept calling me back. And the producers there tell me this doesn't happen normally. But I had two people who told me that, who are very spiritually gifted before this experience happened. So that's how personal and how direct spirituality can be if you can tap into it and receive it in your life.
You said something that I really wanted to hear more about was about physically what happens when people pray and the neuroscience and all of that. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wrote about it in my book. But essentially our centers of kind of rational thinking are quietened so that we can be open to more of a mystical experience, connecting with something. The way they describe it is bigger than yourself. There are other ways that our brain accommodates for it. We see reward centers light up when we're in prayer and meditation and spiritual experiences. And anytime we know that reward centers light up in the brain, we know that that's something we were made for, because it's something that brings us joy and something that is rewarding to us. And especially when dopamine is involved, our brain is taught, okay, that's good, do it again. Now, of course, that can also be true for addictive behaviors, right? So that's not necessarily beneficial, but I don't think that was the original design for dopamine. It was meant to bring pleasure and reward. We've found it in other ways that aren't necessarily helpful, but spirituality is one of those ways that we see the brain changes on the MRI. It was important to me to include those studies. My book, I was very careful in how I talked about spirituality, because like the way I talk about faith in general, I want everybody to feel included in the conversation and not judged. And that voice was really important to me throughout the book. I made it very clear, like, this is my belief. If you don't believe it, that's okay. You're still welcome here. And there are other things that you are going to take from this, because I'm very research-based. I went to Columbia. They drive that home, and some things you can't argue with in terms of science and research. So the feedback I got was that people did feel welcome. And I think that's really important when we're having these conversations about spirituality and faith, is that we meet people where they're at and we approach them with curiosity. And it's not about trying to convince anybody of anything. I really think if you're open to God, you will find God. He'll find you. I call him he, but God is gender neutral. You will find that experience if you're open to it and you're searching for it.
I say it's a he because no woman would have set it up like this.
I always say that's why God made Jesus a man too, because women have so much more to deal with. Putting some of the things we deal with on top of his already difficult life would have been a lot. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about, it's that where your thoughts go, your energy flows, right? And I was thinking about how many times, because I expect God in my life, how many times every day there are these moments that show up that I don't believe they're random and by chance. I believe they're very deliberate and specific, and it's that God nudge that I call, just letting me know the presence is there and I'm connected. And I feel for those folks who are missing out on those beautiful moments.
I believe in that firmly. And there was someone, I don't remember his name, and I'll remember it perfectly once we end this call, but the author of Godwink, just showing that there are signs everywhere. Even the woman, Laura Lynn Jackson, she's more of a medium, but she did write the book Signs. They're everywhere if we're open to seeing them. And there is a part of our brain that is attuned to that as well. It's called the reticular activating system. That once you're aware of something, you begin to see it more and more. And that's, a lot of times, especially, not to say that we're going to get that confirmation every day, but if we're open to it, we will. And there are days that I go where I'm like, God, I haven't really experienced you all that personally lately. And I've been looking. So like, show me something, make me know that, let me know that you're here, that you're paying attention to what's going on, and something inevitably will happen. I will see something or read something that would speak exactly to my experience. Or the other day I was saying a prayer and I was like, I haven't seen this woman in a really long time. In fact, I haven't seen her in probably almost a year, but I'd like to see her the next time I go into this studio. And literally I walked in the door and there she was, So those types of things that can happen when you're open to it.
Yes.
I want to look this up. There was so funny that it's been here it is. So long since Mother Teresa died that I have to say that Mother Teresa was a sainted nun who worked with orphans in India, in Calcutta. And but what shocked me, because she was just Mother Teresa, was that right after she died, there was a book that explored some of the letters and I'm just going to read this, that revealed a terrible darkness inside of her, a profound doubt about the self-sacrifice of her mission and doubting the existence of God. She said, the silence and emptiness is so great that I look and do not see, listen and do not hear. So I guess everybody can go through a period where they doubt, if Mother Teresa can. And that just blew me away when I saw that.
I've talked to so many pastors who are so confident when they're speaking that have all gone through periods of that, and even over the last few weeks. And, and I feel like I've gotten to a point in my life where it's not that I doubt God. I'm just like doubting, okay, are you watching what's going on? I think suffering does that to us. And Mother Teresa saw so much suffering in her lifetime, and even just seeing suffering in the world, all over the world right now, that grieves your heart. I feel like it brings up those questions, but again, I go back to this world is not our final destination. There is suffering in this world, and that's detailed in almost every world religion, that there's going to be suffering in this world. But the hope in my faith is that this is not where it ends, that will be restored.
The interesting thing about even what's happening now is it's been a long time since the world has all been focused on the same thing. So everybody's attention right now is here. And if, then you think about, is there a way for us to not be passive bystanders watching this suffering, but how do we unite to bring in light and goodness and help turn around the situation, because we are expecting something different, and kind of fight back with those evil forces. So it'll be interesting how it plays out. Unfortunately, like, there is horrific things going on that I can't even comprehend. And it does raise these questions. However, in that, I am looking for the wisdom and change that happens because it's triggered by all of this.
Niro, when we started working on this and how we found you, is we really wanted to talk about how we can sometimes suppress our need for the spirituality or things that we value inside of ourselves, as we put everybody else first and what they want. And kind of wanted to explore that a little bit. Particularly, I had been in a relationship with an atheist, which that's hard. I mean, when you've got a relationship with somebody who believes in God, you got a place to go together. And I don't mean physically, but there's a connection point there that's very profound. But when you don't have that, it's difficult. And to an extension, I think that there are people who they get, not just with atheists, but that, these things that mean something to them, even if it's somebody who did like to go to church every week and then stops because of it, that they back burner whatever it is that fills them up. So you want to roll with that for a little bit?
Yeah, I think it is really hard. I mean, not to say that it can't be done, but I think on some level, you have to put your faith at a distance if the closest person to you is opposed to it or doesn't believe it. And the way I see it is, for me, my faith is how I navigate everything. It's how I understand life. And also, if someone's going to truly understand me, they have to understand my faith belief. It's how I make decisions. And if you think about even in a relationship or a partnership, if one person is making decisions, there are times, when I was about to write the book, I told my husband, hey, I need to cut down my practice in half. Why? Because I have this spiritual sense. I feel like God told me I need to do it because there's something more coming. And he got that. He understood that. Now that was a financial decision, me cutting my practice down and have to make room for whatever this more was. At the time, I didn't know. But a year later, I had an acquisitions editor find me and say, I came across your name, an interview on a podcast. Are you working on any books? And because spiritually, I literally, when I say, I don't hear an audible voice from God, but I have a knowing I knew that I had to start working on a book proposal. I didn't know when it was going to happen. Didn't expect someone was going to find me, that I didn't have to shop a book, which is rare. But my husband understood that. It didn't happen. My husband understood that. The way we raise our kids is very much through our spiritual values. So you can do it. I'm sure there are people who do it, but the women I've met where their faith, and a lot of times it's the women, I don't know why, but the women I've met whose faith is really important to them, it is painful that they can't share it with the person who's the most important to them. And it's almost like as you grow closer to God and as your faith grows, you grow a little bit more distance from that partner. So that's why you kind of put it on the back burner, because you don't want distance between you and the person who's most important to you, right? So it is difficult. It is difficult. It might be something that has to be talked about, sooner than later. How do we navigate this with me feeling this way and you feeling this way?
Well, I know I'm one of my relationships. Same thing. I was faithful. I grew up, where I wanted to go to church on Sundays and he was not. And it got to the point where it was, well, you can't go without me because it will look bad. Like I'm not interested in, a much more, this was like what I dealt with, much more practical of like, well, no, I'm not going, but you shouldn't be going either because it doesn't look good if I'm not there with you. And I wouldn't go. I would make that choice not to go because it was easier for me. So I would find other ways to, develop my relationship and invest in that. But it wasn't physically in church for a long time and then resent that. And I think that happens. I know that, I hear of that happening a lot to women. They may fight and just say, to heck with it, I'm going anyway. But it's a huge point of contention in their relationship.
It is. And also you don't want to create tension, right? So sometimes you do pick the easier way because it's what's going to create peace in your everyday life versus a battle. So I do understand when women make that decision as well. And I don't think it's easy for them.
It's interesting how many times I've been asked by people, how do you know? And I really liked how you said that you had the gift of faith because you don't know. And there was an Orthodox rabbi nearby who kept pestering me to come to his house for lunch. And he went, and the house was also the synagogue. And you had the side on the left for men and the side on the right for women. And he's like, you've got to come to services. And I'm like, I will never pray where they segregate men from women. That won't happen. I said, but what I did want to know was, why was my mother sick for 2 decades? More than 2 decades, had a stroke that paralyzed her, then Alzheimer's. I said, why? She's the best person I ever met in my life. And he goes, there are no answers. And I thought, well, that's a crock. And I said, that's not good enough. And he goes, there are no answers. But over time, I came to realize that is the answer, right? That we're never going to have answers to satisfy doubters on why things are messed up and sometimes ugly and sick and evil. There's not an explanation. But that gift of faith you're talking about gives you a place to go when you're just trying to get through it.
That's right. And I always say there are going to be answers we don't have this side of heaven. We don't. And even if we had them, they wouldn't be good enough to justify what we're seeing. I live 15 minutes away from Newtown, Connecticut. So worked with people who lost children in Newtown. And now, unfortunately, that's becoming more commonplace. But there's no answer that's good enough in this life for them to understand that. And the one thing that I was attracted to about the Christian faith in general is when you look at Jesus, who was perfect, he suffered. Yeah. He suffered. And it wasn't about not having suffering in this life, but it was about having hope as you're going through suffering. Yeah. And that's really the essence of the Christian faith, that yes, you will suffer, but you won't be alone in it. And then there is hope after. So it is a gift to have that faith. And at the same time, I will say every person whose faith that I've admired has gone through a point in their life where they've said, is this really real? Is this real? And then you go back to, okay, but I had this experience and this experience and this. So yes. And I'm going to go with it, and then you begin to experience and see it more. But it's a normal human emotion to doubt, to question. But I always say, bring those doubts to God. Say, all right, I'm not feeling it right now. So show up, show up. Yeah. And in my life, I've seen him show up.
Definitely. Well, for people who are in this place where they're curious and they don't know how to start exploring spirituality or faith, what recommendations or thoughts would you have for them?
So many ways to do it. One, and they may not know someone who has faith, but many people do. Many people know people who have faith. Have conversations, get curious, ask the questions that you are afraid to ask of those people, and listen to what they have to say about it. I am a big believer in that we can talk to God directly and ask God, show me who you are, be real to me. And that's the first step of openness spiritually, to go with curiosity to God. Bring God your doubts. I mean, he already knows. He knows everything. Tell him what you're feeling and why you don't think this is real, but stay open to receiving answers. For me, reading scripture, I learn a lot. And sometimes I will read things that speak directly to what I'm feeling and going through my life. So that's always a good thing. For people who've been nominal in their faith, meaning that they have a faith, there are great daily reading books or devotional books, really little bite-sized teachings that can help lead us through that spiritual journey. But I'm a big believer in you can go directly to the source and ask to go on this journey together. And
it doesn't have to be formal, right? It can be like, that's the other thing that we think it has to be like all formal.
No, it doesn't.
I love that because, I was speaking in St. Louis. I wish I knew who said this to me because I've thought of this over and over again for years and years. But there's a woman, she was Christian, and we were talking. I said, I just feel like God loves me more than anybody else. And she said, isn't that the definition of a perfect parent? Where all the children think they are loved the most? And that really touched me a lot because I do what you're saying. I have that direct conversation. I don't follow the rules of my religion or anybody's religion, but we got a good thing going on. And, being Jewish, we don't believe in Jesus as more than a rabbi. And one time I did say, Jesus, if I'm supposed to believe in you, you're going to have to show me something big. My dad's a Holocaust survivor. So if I got to make a change, you got to show me, because otherwise I'm just going to do what I'm doing because it seems to be working. And nothing happens. So I just keep doing what I'm doing and it seems to be working. And I hope every one of our listeners has something that they can do that works for them, that they have a place to go, and that, in these crazy times, which they are crazy, that you're never alone.
So. I love that. And I think that analogy of the perfect parent is exactly right. I think that also makes it hard for people who haven't had good parents to connect with the idea of God as a parent, a mother or a father, and I have seen that even in the work that I've done as a therapist. So, but to think about, okay, you didn't have the perfect parent, but what would that be like? And you can have that spiritually, is a hope that hopefully people can tap into. But I love that analogy because that's what it is. That's really what it is.
Awesome. This has been so good. There were a couple things I was kind of taking down as a reminder, I think, for our leaders and our listeners. And I think you were talking about faith being a gift, and that faith is also built on trust. And what builds trust is time and effort. So leaning in and really, really investing in that relationship and trusting that, you're putting a deposit in so that presence is there stronger and stronger for you. And reminding us too that life just has suffering and that faith is there to give us hope through that suffering. I also kind of my last big takeaway was just the reminding us to be curious and take time to connect with the light, the positive things, and practice gratitude, because gratitude, even though we didn't use those words, you were speaking to that a lot, but gratitude is what helps that, where you feel present in the good and the light and all of those things that God's love has to offer. Thank you so much for being with us today. This was really, my heart feels full.
Oh, thank you for having me and for having this conversation. It was beautiful to talk about it with the two of you.
Well, Niro, how do you want people to contact you, and tell us what you want to say tonight?
Sure. The easiest way is through my website, nirofeliciano.com. And I'm on Instagram. I do a lot of work on Instagram, Niro Feliciano. And I do have a podcast too called All Things Life. And that you'll see a link to on my website, but it's also everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Oh,
and your book. Let's talk about that
my book
one last time.
Yep, this book won't make you happy. And it's 8 keys to finding true contentment. And there's info on that on my website as well.
Fantastic.
It's been amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.